Hello and greetings, everyone. I welcome you warmly to this Primary Source online seminar about teaching the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Our session features an overview of this crucial core global studies topic that's so important across the whole curriculum, and that will be presented this evening by Dr. Marie Gleason, a program director here with me at Primary Source. It features as well many dazzling curriculum ideas, classroom activities, and teaching resources that will be co-presented by Anne-Marie and by a classroom teacher and committed global educator, Kelly Neely. So I want to welcome both of you, Kelly and Anne-Marie, and thank you for joining us. Kelly from the Brimmer and May School, I should have said. Thank you so much, both of you, for being here. We're really excited to hear from you, and I'll be introducing our presenters more formally in just a few moments. But let me say first that I'm Susan Zeiger, a program director at Primary Source, and I'll want to tell you first about this series, the series that this webinar this evening is part of. This is a series this spring that we have offered on ways to engage young U.S. students primarily in thinking about global campaigns for justice around the world and here in the United States. On January 18th, we had our first session of the series, Sports and the Right to Play, a Global Human Rights Issue, which featured researcher, athlete, and international disability rights advocate Eli Wolf. This evening, of course, we have Teaching the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And then we're excited to announce, breaking news, our third session, which will take place on Tuesday, March 14th. And that will be an examination of the abolition campaign to end modern-day global slavery and human trafficking. Our speaker that evening in March will be Ken Morris, who is a direct descendant of the great Frederick Douglass, who has been much in the news lately this month. And Ken's organization, the Frederick Douglass Family Initiative, specializes in work with schools and teachers to end human trafficking. So that should really be a fascinating session. This is our second year at Primary Source of sponsoring a Global Action for Social Justice series. Last year, our series of 3 examined children's human rights, transnational perspectives on violence against women, and the global climate action movement. And if you missed those last year, you can find each of these as a recording on our YouTube channel. We'll say a bit more about that later tonight, but all of them are accessible and open source for those of you who are in the educator community and would like to learn more about these topics. This entire series on social justice issues in global context, designed with middle and high school teachers specifically in mind, is made possible by a generous grant from the Cummings Foundation, and we are so grateful to the Cummings Foundation for that support. I want to welcome all of you who are joining us from many parts of the country, and thank you for making the time to join us this evening. Special acknowledgement to those of you who are participating in the full series for credit. We've been very excited to read your reflections about the first session and look forward to those that you'll be sharing about the evening tonight as well. Later in the hour, speaking of your responses to this material, we'll have a designated block of time for your questions and comments. But we do encourage you to begin entering your thoughts as soon as they occur to you in the chat box in the lower left of your computer screen. And just remember, if you type that in, just like old-fashioned AOL, enter and push enter, and your comment will post up for the group to see. We as the moderators will be combing through those and answering as many of those as we can in our Q&A period of time. Finally, toward the end of our session, we'll have an opportunity to share some high-quality classroom resources that Primary Source has curated in conjunction with this session. These are available for anyone who'd like to use them. They are gathered together in a free online resource guide, which is one of our 60-plus topical resource guides for global and multicultural learning in schools. And that brings me to a good segue to speak for a moment about our organization. So Primary Source, for those of you who are new to us, is a not-for-profit organization that partners with educators to bring global and cultural knowledge and awareness into K through 12 classrooms and schools. We are more than 25 years old. The heart of our work is professional development that's carried out in many different formats, face-to-face, study tours, online, book discussion groups, and so forth. We're also a resource center for global education. We do curriculum development and school consulting as well. So we welcome you to join us and learn more about our work, and we'll close out this evening by sharing some easy ways to do that. And with that, we'd like to turn to our topic tonight. We have, as I said at the beginning, not one, but two marvelous presenters for this session. So I will introduce them both, and then they'll speak in kind of a tag team style. And both will, Kelly and Anne-Marie will be available at the end during the question and answer to respond as they see fit to your questions. So Marie Gleason. Marie Gleason, my colleague here at Primary Source, holds a PhD in Curriculum and Instruction from Boston College, where she teaches elementary and secondary social studies methods. Previously, she worked with K through 16 students and teachers at both the Roosevelt and the Kennedy Presidential Libraries. As a program director at Primary Source since 2010, she's taken the lead on numerous course development projects, including our online course, Global Understanding and Action, Human Rights, Educational Access, and Gender Equity, and our upcoming 2017 Summer Institute with the National Endowment for the Humanities called Foreign Exchanges, the U.S. and the Wider World in the 20th Century. Anne-Marie is presented at the National Council of the Social Studies and the American Educational Research Association. You can find her publications in the journal Social Studies and the Young Learner, the American Educational Research Journal, and EdWeek, among others. Anne-Marie and I are delighted and privileged as well this evening to be joined by global educator Kelly Neely. Kelly has taught for 17 years at Brimmer and May, which is a pre-K through 12th grade independent school in Massachusetts. There, she's the Director of Global Studies and the Humanities Department co-chair, and she manages the upper school's Global Studies Diploma and Winterim travel programs. And it's interesting to note that Brimmer and May is the only school in New England that's been cited as a model school for 21st century learning by the National Association of Independent Schools, in part because of the amazing work that Kelly has done. Kelly holds a BS in Secondary Education in English from the University of Maine, Farmington, and an ALM in History from Harvard University's Division of Continuing Education. In her time at Brimmer, she's taught middle school English and history of India and China, and she's created and taught high school elective courses, including the Family and Society in India and China, Women's Studies, a Global Perspective, and as well a Survey of Global Studies. Kelly loves traveling the globe, both with and without students, as well as incorporating the study of global issues, fostering student empathy, and using project-based learning in her curricula, and she'll be touching upon a number of those topics in her presentation tonight. So with that, I think we are ready to turn this over to Anne-Marie, and I welcome you to launch our presentation for the evening.
No, great. Thank you, Susan. Kelly and I are really excited for this conversation about the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So we'll start tonight with a brief overview of the goals and then move to classroom applications and resources. So when we begin, we'll kind of think about, well, so what are the global goals? In September 2015, the United Nations released the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, And this agenda really builds upon the success of the previous program under the Millennium Development Goals. The Millennium Development Goals had been a plan with worldwide goals from 2000 to 2015, which met a number of ambitious goals, particularly in reducing poverty and increasing children in education. The successes of the Millennium Development Goals really motivated and inspired people to continue this work, which then developed in 2015 to become this new Sustainable Development Goals as a program and as a plan for more goals to have until 2030. So the SDGs, these Sustainable Development Goals, serve as a new action plan to address 17 different issues that impact people and the planet. And you can see the icons for the 17 different goals here on your screen, which I'll explain in a moment. But just before we move forward, just a note, the Sustainable Development Goals have two different abbreviated names that people tend to use to refer to the goals. The SDGs, or the Global Goals, are both terms that you'll hear me say tonight that all refer to the same thing as the Sustainable Development Goals. So just to describe the rationale as presented in the agenda for the Agenda for Sustainable Development, the overarching goal between now and 2030 is to end poverty and hunger everywhere, combat inequalities within and among countries, build peaceful and inclusive societies, protect human rights, gender equality and empowerment, protect the planet and natural resources, and create conditions for sustainable, sustained economic growth. So in other words, a plan to guide global development in ways that sustain growth, reduce inequalities, and protect natural resources. So we'll talk tonight about how this agenda tries to do that. So I wanted to also just get out a term there too, if these are the Sustainable Development Goals. So what is sustainable development? Sustainable development stands at the core of the global goals. The United Nations defines sustainable development as development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. The global goals place economic growth within the context of environmental protection and social inclusion. So all three of these concepts are valued and should be equally considered when nations set policies and plans for further development. So that really sets the core of this work. And in doing so, the Sustainable Development Goals focus on people, the planet, prosperity, peace, and partnership. Those are the five key components that are featured and explicitly mentioned in the Agenda for Sustainable Development. And to get to a place to address goals that are important, this agenda has 17 goals that address big concepts like reducing poverty, taking action on climate, and quality education. Each goal has a number of targets. There are actually 169 targets in all, so it's quite massive, and that the different targets break down the goal into particular outcomes to achieve by the year 2030. And I'll give you an example of that in a moment. But all countries around the world and stakeholders are expected to make the goals a priority and work together to address the goals. So these goals are intended to promote inclusive and positive practices for all nations and individuals. So I'm not going to read to you the 17 goals in their statements, but they're here on the screen. The first 8 ones are here, so I won't read them, but what you can see is the main issues addressed. So again, the goals are focusing on things like ending poverty, ending hunger, promoting health and well-being, thinking about quality education, gender equality, access to clean water, sustainable energy, and sustainable economic growth. So those are the first 8 goals here, and we'll keep coming back to these. And then the rest of them, goals 9 through 17, set out to address challenges related to the infrastructure of communities, reducing inequalities, thinking about sustainable consumption and production, combating climate change, conserving oceans, thinking about terrestrial ecosystems, so life on land, and supporting institutions for peace and justice, and strengthening global partnerships to achieve these goals. So the emphasis here in those last two goals, on goals 16 and 17, on inclusive societies and justice for all, and the global partnership to implement these goals, is one of the reasons why we chose to focus on the global goals in our program on global social action. So really thinking of these goals in terms of of fulfilling or thinking about social justice issues, looking at marginalized and vulnerable communities and ways that development can both promote a sustainable and healthy environment and be good and helpful and peaceful for people involved. So kind of thinking about those elements. So here's an example of one of the goals and the targets, which I said I'd mention. So here, goal 1 is, you'll see here on the very top, to end poverty in all its forms everywhere. So then you'll see, and this is just from the website, from one of the websites for the Sustainable Development Goals, which we'll share with you the URLs in a moment. But you can see then there are targets for the goal. There's actually, I've only listed here in the screenshot just 2 targets. There's a few more for this particular goal. But you'll see here target 1.1 is to eradicate people living on less than $1.25 per day. And they use the number of people below the international poverty line to measure that outcome. And that outcome is listed as an indicator there. So that indicator 1.1.1. Target 1.2 is to have the proportion of people living in poverty, and national definitions of poverty are used to measure that outcome. So you'll see that on the right-hand side for the indicators. So each of the 17 goals have targets and particular indicators to measure progress. So the international community is really looking at particular sets of information and outcomes that they're looking for, and using particular data to measure success for this. So there are 169 targets in all. So it's a pretty ambitious agenda. So now going back to the image that I began with, which might make a little bit more sense here. So this is an image with icons for each of the 17 different goals. And as you begin to work with this content, and particularly if you use some of the materials created by the UN, you'll see these icons all over the place. These have become the symbols for the various goals, and they're very prevalent in all of the materials that have been created around these goals. So again, we're looking at the goals around no poverty, zero hunger, good health and well-being, quality education, gender equality, clean water and sanitation, affordable and clean energy, decent work and economic growth, industry, innovation, infrastructure, reduced inequalities, sustainable cities and communities, responsible consumption and production, climate action, life below water, life on land, peace, justice, and strong institutions, and those partnerships. So when we think about why are the global goals important, and they're important because at this point in time, the world faces global challenges to sustainable development. There are rising inequalities within and among nations. The world is rapidly facing a depletion of natural resources as nations struggle to provide for its people. The rising population puts a further strain on resources, and climate change from global processes places many at risk, particularly already vulnerable populations. So these goals are intended to address these challenges. And they do that the global goals actually impact every nation and person on the planet. So international bodies, nations, and individuals are all impacted by the goals and share responsibility for their success. Nations are charged with making progress on the goals. Individuals can also play a part by taking action and joining campaigns. So this also shows one of the challenges is that nations on a whole are committing to being responsible for the global goals, but in terms of enforcement, there aren't as many mechanisms to make sure that the global goals will be being met. However, the targets and the outcomes are one way to keep this program accountable. The This global reach is part of the rationale for teaching about the global goals. These are issues that directly affect our students' lives today and in the future, as they will be responsible for making these goals a reality. There are particular ways that students can become involved in campaigns to support the SDGs, and studying these issues provides authentic context for instruction and assessment. So students will be more engaged in this content because they'll see how what they're studying in school relates to the real world, so that authentic intellectual work is a really strong motivation for why we should teach the global goals. And these issues can be studied in all subject areas and offer natural cross and interdisciplinary collaborations. And it'll look very different at all grade levels, but students in all grades can start to think about and address some of the concepts with the global goals. I'll show you some of the resources that are for younger students, but really giving some students agency and opportunities to make change and to be part of the change. So here you'll see in this cartoon from the global goals of students asking, well, what can we do? And as individuals, you can think about it, talk about it, dream, write, make art, and act on it. So tonight we'll talk about ways that you can help students do that. So to give an example of how the global goals might be addressed in different subject areas and grade levels, let's take a look at Goal 6 for clean water and sanitation. One of the targets for this goal is to ensure that all have access to safe water. So here, elementary students could read a book like Mimi's Village, which is a story about how unsanitary water can lead to disease and serious health crises. The book highlights the problem that not all communities have access to clean water, and this could lead to conversations about access to clean water around the world, including the United States. So students could think about how systems that keep their water clean. They could also examine cases of unsafe drinking water in their own communities and in other American communities as well. So there's local and international components there. Older students could use data, such as the proportion of the population using improved drinking water sources that's visualized in the map on the top of the screen. They could use the data to investigate how water issues affect people around the world. Math and science classes can examine quantitative data and the scientific processes, such as those used to make water safe for drinking. So that's a science and math application. Social studies and English language arts courses could read a report, such as the UN publication that's on the screen, about clean water and sanitation, and explore social, political, and economic dimensions of water pollution. World language courses could explore water issues in regions where the studied language is spoken. Newcomer students could explore water issues in their home countries or native language. Art classes could explore art that's been created in response to the crisis and construct their own water-related work. So for example, the artwork featuring the orca at the bottom of the slide is from the Water Education and Technology Science Center in Washington State. With help from the One Art Project, middle and high school students used what they learned about water to create this hanging sculpture. And all of these examples, allow students to think deeply about global issues through different disciplinary perspectives. Clean water and sanitation could also be addressed through varying pedagogical approaches. So for example, students could delve into a deep problem-based learning project to invent a product to combat water pollution in a particular region. Or students could undertake a social action project within or beyond their communities to raise awareness on water issues or support other campaigns working to bring change, like the UNICEF World Toilet Project, or explore solutions proposed by organizations like water.org, which is dedicated to supporting water equity solutions. So these global topics are an important opportunity for students to connect to their local communities and beyond, and with other organizations and groups that are already doing work in this field. So in another example, here we'll look at students could investigate the sustainable cities and communities. So Goal 11's emphasis is on making cities and settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. So here with this goal, elementary students could participate in a program such as there's a program called Gingerbread STEM where they create realistic models of their own communities out of gingerbread, and then they share their work through Skype with students in another town or another country. And this is a way to get students thinking about their own communities. It has to be a realistic model, and then learning about others there. And that's a great, if you do hashtag gingerbread STEM to follow some of the work that's been going on there. Middle school students could do a lesson on understanding sustainable living, where they read about children's lives in different countries. They calculate their own ecological footprint and think about ways to increase their sustainable practices. I'll show you the link to get resources like the lesson plan that's here on the screen, and you could actually do this lesson plan with your students as well. High school students could explore the concept of environmental justice and examine the infrastructures of marginalized or vulnerable communities. They might be able to design inclusive and sustainable spaces in their own communities. Think about what clean energy mechanisms might be more useful or could be used in their community as represented in the picture here on the screen. So lots of different ways that students could think holistically that you could incorporate different pedagogical approaches to teaching these goals. And so to think a little bit more deeply about this, I wanted to spend a few minutes looking at a specific example where a teacher has integrated the global goals into her curriculum. And then after Kelly speaks, then we will I'll come back and talk about some more resources that might be useful. So as Susan introduced Kelly Neely, she teaches at Brimmer in May in Chestnut Hill, Massachusetts. And so she's going to share some of the work she's done with her students in a global studies class. So although this is a high school social studies example, I think you'll see ways to adapt some of her content to fit your own work if you teach in a different subject or a different grade level. And then as I mentioned, when Kelly's finished, I'll provide other teaching approaches and resources to support this work in other grades and disciplines. So at this point, Kelly, I'm going to turn the microphone over to you.
Okay, thank you, Anne-Marie. Okay, so I'm going to take a few minutes to describe an elective course that I created about 3 years ago for our Global Studies Diploma program, although not all students in the class are in the program, and we actually get quite a few students in our upper school that are not in the Global Studies program but would like to take some of our global courses. This is a half-year course, and it's very much discussion-based, and I tell the students at the beginning of the semester that it really is very student-focused. The course is often generated by topics brought up by the students, although we do follow 3 specific strands in the course. So under the course themes, the strands that I use are engaging with the world through media and action, successful and unsuccessful approaches to eradicating global poverty, and then, of course, the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And I find that these have really become sort of organically the foundation for everything that we discuss in the course. The subtopics under the goals that I tend to focus on in the course are gender studies, the global economy, the environment, education, global health, and social justice. And I tell the students this really is a social justice course. Sometimes they're a little bit surprised about that. They come in thinking it's going to be a history course, since I also teach history, and then they're pleasantly surprised to realize that it's actually a social justice course. And they really like that. And so because it is very student-directed, even though these are the subtopics that I tend to plan for, I keep it very much open for the students to actually bring in topics that they're interested in that fall within these strands. So the first strand that we tend to look at is the engaging with the world through media and action. And I tell the students, you know, it's so important as global citizens to really be engaged with what's going on. So I introduced to them 2 sources of social media that we use in the classroom, Twitter and Pearl Trees. And in my Twitter page, I follow a lot of globally based organizations. And so I encourage the students to go into that page, see who we're following. This is the official Twitter page for our Global Studies Diploma program, and encourage the students to follow a lot of the media sources that are on this page. We also use a program called Pearl Trees, which is somewhat similar to Pinterest, where you can curate collections on different topics. And what I like about it is there's a team up option, so that the students can also be sharing information and seeing what I share. And so it's very much a collaborative effort. And then I also share with them several globally focused news sources that they can sign up for in terms of newsletters that they can get. So Global Voices, Fast Coexist, the Representation Project, Take Part, GRIST, which is environmentally based, and globalcitizen.org. The Representation Project is not exactly globally based, however, it does a lot with gender issues, and so since that is part of the global goals and part of what we talk about, I keep that in there. And then during the course of the class, the students are very much, you know, encouraged to bring in stories that they see and talk a lot about the media that they are coming across. The other thing that I introduced them to is the United Nations Take Action page, which is also on, this is part of the UN Sustainable Development page, and it's titled The Lazy Person's Guide to Saving the World, which I figure it does a good job at getting the students' attention. And so as far as starting to act, they have put together some really great lists of things that you can do, starting from your couch, moving to at home, and then moving to things that you can do outside your house. And then another strand that we do is looking at successful and unsuccessful approaches to eradicating global poverty. So I use 3 different texts in this semester, and right now we are working with Out of Poverty, and this really focuses on Paul Pollack's work in the developing world, working with farmers to get out of poverty. Banker to the Poor, which focuses on microlending in Bangladesh, and then Mountains Beyond Mountains by Tracy Kidder, which focuses on Paul Farmer's work in Partners in Health. And then through the course of the semester, I do a lot of films with the students. So at the same time that we are reading Out of Poverty, we're also watching the film Poverty, Inc., which is available right now. It's streaming on Netflix. But if you also go into Rocco Films, they have an educator's version, which comes with a course guide. We also look at Living on $1, which does a good job of highlighting what it's like to try to live on $1 a day. It's very eye-opening for the students. And then Markets Without Borders, which is one of many resources that ISIT.org puts together. Another one that they do also highlights Muhammad Yunus's work on microlending, so I show that to the students as well. And I really feel like it's important to focus on eradicating poverty because it is SDG number 1. It's really an overarching theme of the course, and I feel very strongly that all the goals connect to it. And we start off the semester with a conversation about that. And so we use all of this to frame our discussion of how to successfully address poverty, what has worked, what versus what not has worked so far. And then our third theme is the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And what I do is I task the students with following 2 of the goals through the semester and sharing resources with the class that will shape our discussion. So they have to create their own Pearl Trees pages. They also have to look for information about the goals using the resources that I suggested earlier on, but also any resources that they come across, and then bringing in information that will highlight what is being done to eradicate or to address these goals. They also do a final project at the end of the semester using Sutori.com, which used to be History.co, and they've since changed over to Sutori. And they go more in depth in terms of researching their SDGs and do a presentation at the end of the semester. Some of the films that I also use with them at times, and sometimes, I'll switch them in and out depending on what we're actually talking about in the semester. But Girl Rising tends to be a favorite, and I've had a student request it, so even though I didn't use it last year, I'll probably be doing it again this year. Sushi, the Global Catch, which a student brought to my attention last year, is about the sushi industry and what that is doing to impact the world's oceans. And then A Place at the Table and Misrepresentation, which are both based in the US, but also, as you can see, the numbers next to them are the different SDGs that they do address. And so I think it's really helpful for the students to, to recognize that looking at the Sustainable Development Goals is a paradigm for really how they examine the world around them. And so we tend to have very rich discussions about which goals a film or a news article or a TED Talk or what have you might be addressing at the time. An example of that is yesterday we looked at Boylan Flats Clean Ocean Project, and that was highlighted in the Huffington Post about a year or 2 ago, and I had saved it in my Pearl Trees page. And this was an 18-year-old student who came up with a really great idea for cleaning the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. And so we had a really great discussion about that. So it's really important for the students to see that these goals are being addressed, that a lot of what they read about really connects to the goals, and that it doesn't have to be very successful people who are middle-aged who are addressing these things. It can be teenagers, and it can be, people close to their age. So I've also put a couple of other web resources on here. There are some good TED Talks about the goals and what does it mean to be a citizen of the world. Does a good job at also looking at globalcitizen.org, and that one's very helpful as well. And then the ocean cleanup, and then health in 2015. And finally, I cannot emphasize this enough, everything connects to the goals. And so that tends to be a rich discussion that we have throughout the semester, and we really can't escape them because they really picture everything that we do. And the students they find that it really helps them to understand the world around them, and it really gives them a lens through which to go into all of their other classes as well. So that's all I have for now. I'm going to turn it back over to Anne-Marie.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Kelly. This was so helpful for sharing your work. And you're going to be back on with us in a little bit for the question and answers. And I can already see that there are a few questions for you. So we will definitely address that in a bit. But before we get to that, I just wanted to introduce a few other teaching strategies and resources here that might be helpful for you, and they kind of build on a lot of the work that Kelly just mentioned as well. So one of the ways that I like to get people thinking about the global goals is to use the My World survey. So this survey was created and distributed in 2015 by the United Nations to let people all over the world vote on issues that were of most concern to them. the idea was that the results of this survey would be used to actually help create the Sustainable Development Goals. The survey is still online, and you can still take the survey. And I find it's a great way for people to think about their priorities. So the survey lists 17 issues that you can see on the right-hand side of the screen. It's a little bit small there. But the 17 issues, and asks respondents to choose 6 issues that are most important to them and their family. So which issues matter most? As students start to kind of think about their priorities, I have them, I have people choose the 6 most important matters for them, and then share their responses with others. And so as we begin to share our responses with others, this leads to a great opening discussion about needs and wants and access to resources. People start to recognize that their own priorities and agendas may be very different than others. The URL here is on the screen. It's at votemyworld2015.org. It'll also be listed on the resource guide for you. You can take it online, or you can print out a copy of the survey. I think I actually made a Word document at one point with the issues for people to choose. So I also do this as a paper and pencil thing. But what's one of the more interesting things about this survey is that students can then look at results from people who took the survey from all over the world. The last time I checked, there were almost 10 million responses to this survey from all around the world. The countries that had the most responses were actually Nigeria and Mexico. The U.S., I think, was somewhere in the top 10 of respondents. But what students can do, what anyone can do, is to look at the results, and you can compare how your views ranked priorities to people in other countries. So this is just a screenshot of one element of the results, but the platform is actually, it's interactive, and it allows students to see how people in specific countries voted, or to examine how the votes differed by gender, age group, or a country's standing on the Human Development Index. So again, it's a great conversation starter to begin to think about why certain countries or peoples might have different priorities than K-12 students living in the United States. When I've used the survey in the U.S., a lot of American students are typically surprised by their results compared to the rest of the world. Good education is frequently a top choice, particularly when I use this with teachers. But issues that tend to rate high in the U.S., like climate change, for example, are much lower priorities internationally than on this survey. So it's a good way to start thinking about your own positionality on what issues are important to you, and then how that may differ across the world. So the My World survey, great conversation starter. If you're looking for ways to introduce the global goals to students, you'll definitely want to visit the world's largest lesson. This past September, the UN and other organizations promoted the global goals with the world's largest lesson. So the campaign was for classrooms all around the world to focus on the goals during a specific week in September. Resources were created to help teachers achieve this. So on this website, you can find resources such as student-friendly videos explaining the goals. There are sources for younger and older students, so across the grade span. The video screenshot on the screen here was written by Sir Ken Robinson with an introduction from Emma Watson. So it's a great source for middle school and high school students. It's animated. It tells the stories of how young people are taking action to create change. So as Kelly mentioned, that it being important for her students to see people like them, this video is a great example where it's the stories of young people in high school, middle school, who have created things or have tried to do something to make change for the global goals. So the world's largest lesson video, it's a great place to start. The world's largest lesson also has educator guides to help you think about the concepts for your students. So if you're looking for a little bit more guidance, there's definitely resources on the site for that. There's also different resources that include things like graphic novels and posters that you can download and view the whole graphic novel with students. So these sources could help students understand the nature of the goals while exploring life in other places around the world. So for example, this graphic novel from India on the left-hand side of your screen, it starts to introduce the goals, focusing particularly on education, and students get a chance to see what education in India is like. There's lots of resources that you can download for your classroom, like posters. So here, this poster on industry, innovation, and infrastructure, Goal 9. So helping students see why we need to be connected to work towards an innovation to help infrastructure, industrialization, technological support, and affordable internet access for all. So it gets students thinking about the goals. The website also, this is still from the World's Largest Lesson, it offers detailed lesson plans for various ages and content. So for example, here's a lesson plan created by the United Nations Energy Program for students ages 11 to 14 that explores renewable energy. And it could be used to address science and social studies content. So students are thinking about how energy is used, what they might be able to do, and these are concrete lessons. So, this one's thinking about it in a 60-minute lesson. You could certainly take different pieces of this lesson if you don't have a lot of time to integrate some of this content. So lots of different entry points for you with these resources. Since efforts to address the SDGs are ongoing, social media is a great source for content and lesson ideas on the goals. Again, Kelly just shared that she uses social media with her students. Here, if you follow the handle @GlobalGoalsUN or the hashtag #GlobalGoals, you'll find an abundance of documents, images, and other media related to the goals. High school students could use the feeds to see what are videos that the UN has put out about UN meetings that address the goals. So you can see them, as they happen. Younger students could learn about other children's efforts to address the goals through the stories that are posted, and just to get a sense of how and who is involved in this. Your class could post their work on the goals to an international audience by using the hashtag #GlobalGoals. Particularly in September when the campaign for the World's Largest Lesson happened this past September, and I have a feeling it will happen again this coming September. You could see there were images from students all around the world as they were, really working on the same work as counterparts in the U.S. or in India or China, thinking about the global goals. These Twitter feeds are also a way for you as an educator and global citizen to stay informed about the progress and the challenges facing the goals. So it might not be the best source for you in terms of your classroom, but as you are trying to become more informed yourself, a great way to think about it. Let's see. And there are also a number of ways to engage and take action on the global goals. You might be interested in the Global Citizen Project. Kelly mentioned this one as well. Global Citizen has action steps and campaigns for young people to join on the global goals. They hosted, you may be familiar with this, again in September of this past year during the start of the UN is when, the general sessions, is when they have the World's Largest Lesson. I think it's September 17th or 18th. And Global Citizen at that time hosted a music festival to celebrate the goals. And attendees had to earn their right to be there by taking action and doing service to attend. And Global Citizen, they have different campaigns and actions rewards programs for taking action by, if you send a letter to a congressperson about an issue, or you you find someone else interested in the same issues that you're interested in. Those are kinds of examples. You can gain a point, and there are different events that take place, like other music events, that people can earn these rewards for, or use these rewards for. So it's an interesting way and lots of little different ideas for students on how to take action in small ways and how to do how to make a difference. So really a kind of a community and clearinghouse for campaigns and social action projects. So a good source to kind of take a look at there. So certainly we didn't have an exhaustive list of resources on the goals, and we'll share a few other resources at the end, but we did want to make sure we had time to address some of your questions.
First, thank you so much, Anne-Marie and Kelly, for a really wonderful, rich presentation with a whole range of ideas, and there have been some great questions in response. So there's quite a bit that we can dig in and talk about. So let me get started by referring back to Catherine Black. Thank you, Catherine, for your great question. I know that you and Kelly had some exchange about it already, but let's go back there and look again and see what other thoughts there might be about it, and Anne-Marie's as well. So I would say that Catherine is struggling with the really good question of how you can keep a course topical when you're doing a lot of current events and still kind of keep to your own teaching goals and kind of make some forward progress without getting too sidetracked. So she put it in this way: how do you plan your class schedule? Do you plan weekly and then adjust based on current events? In my international affairs elective, I found myself drifting in and out of a planned set of lessons in order to answer questions and address things that crop up in the news. So how do you avoid kind of chaos? Suggestions for that.
That's a great question. The first time that I taught the course, I said to my students that they were going to help me actually build the curriculum. And they kind of looked at me like I had 6 heads because they hadn't heard that before. And that year, it was the first time I taught it. There were only 6 students in the course. And I had taught 5 of them the previous semester. So we had built up a pretty good rapport. It was very much a discussion-based class. And that year, I ended up using Storify, and I had them do a lot of blogging about different events. That was actually back when it was still the Millennium Development Goals, so we didn't have as many goals to work with. But the students were really interested in what we were talking about, and they brought in a lot of interesting ideas, a lot of things that they wanted to talk about. And that year, they actually ended up telling me that they wanted to do some sort of fundraising work, and I pushed back a little bit because I said, well, the idea here is to learn about various social justice issues, but I don't want to force anybody to, pay any money or anything like that. And they kept pushing back at me and saying, no, we feel like we really we want to take action, we want to help, and we know that we can't go and interact with the people, the communities that we're reading about, but we really want to do something. So that year, they decided to do a 2-pronged project where they wanted to raise money to support the Girl Rising campaign, which, if you're not familiar with it outlines the stories of, I believe, 9 different girls from different parts of the world and the struggles that they endeavor to get an education. And they were really impassioned about that. And then they also took lessons from UNICEF, the UN, what is it called? The UN Teach UNICEF page. They have a lot of different lessons for all age groups. And so they created, or they adapted lessons for 3 different age groups, and they went into different classrooms and did lessons with them on gender equality and access to education and human rights. And so they ended up raising, I believe, $600 for the Girl Rising Fund, and then they did the education piece. And last year's group definitely was not really that empowered. I guess they were a little bit tougher to work with. I also had 19 of them last year, so the size of the group often tends to impact how it runs. So we did a lot more discussion and film watching, not as much action. This year's group is much more like the first group, and they are very excited about what we're talking about. And they bring in a lot. So I've learned to be flexible. Like I said at the beginning, I use the 3 strands to build the foundation for the course, but the students are often very active at helping to fill it out.
I just want to also add, too, about the piece around teaching current events or trying to stay current all the time. One of the nice things about the global goals is that this is a marathon. It's not a sprint. This is a 15-year plan with a set of goals. So I think there are ways that if you were trying to think more long-term about these topics, and these are issues that there are so many different examples that you could use to get to these issues, that there's always going to be something to talk about or to teach about. So kind of thinking about it in a more long-term, broad sense of, all right, we're going to use an example about redressing looking at poverty, and that's going to happen in May, and we'll do something related to that. So I think there are ways that you could make it a little bit more long-term.
Great, those are really helpful ideas. Thank you. And Marie, I wanted first to, for our participants, again, to encourage you. We're having some great conversations in there, but this is a good time if you have any specific questions. There are still some that we haven't addressed yet, but do feel free to type in your questions or to raise your hand and we can call on you if you want to use the microphone and ask a question. I want to jump in here for a moment and ask a follow-up question for Anne-Marie that I've been thinking about this evening as I've heard this presentation. I always think of new things whenever I hear you present on this topic, and I'm wondering about critiques or controversies surrounding the global goals. Are there any that we should know about? This of course is a very consensus-driven document that involved the participation of thousands and thousands of people, and as you could see, it's been participatory in another sense too, of the social media campaigns surrounding it and the survey and so forth. So there's a lot of buy-in, of course, but I wonder if there are any naysayers or any alternative perspectives or topics related that in that sense that we should be aware of.
Yeah, certainly. I will just say first that I'm not an expert on the topic in the field, but from what I've come across in the last year or two, in terms of critiques, certainly there may be a lot of consensus and buy-in, but there may not be as many financial pieces to support the ambitious goals. This is a really ambitious program that actually, may go against a lot of nations' interests in terms of their own development, particularly when you look at rapid industrialization needed to bring nations out of poverty. It often conflicts with the pieces around environmental sustainability or thinking about it in ways that are more inclusive. So I think there are a lot of internal tensions, and that there's responsibilities of the international community as a whole to join in to be able to work towards these goals. So I think definitely there are critiques around how it will be funded, whose responsibility, how this will be enforced. I mentioned before that there are targets for particular measurements on outcomes, but again, what's the enforcement mechanism? But people said that about the Millennium Development Goals as well, the previous 15-year program. And although there were aspects of that program that did not reach expectations, they certainly were able to achieve a lot of work, particularly around reducing poverty. So I think the idea and the hope for this program is to have something that's ambitious so that we might make it and address those goals.
Great. Yeah, that's great. Kelly, maybe this is a good place to ask you this question too. It occurs to me that we haven't talked about the political climate in which one teaches about this topic, and I wonder whether you've ever had pushback from parents, administrators. Have you felt voices in your head asking you about whether this was a too politicized or a political topic, or whether there were other points of view you should be incorporating? What's your take on some of those complicated questions that so many of us face, and certainly in global education it comes up all the time?
It's true. No, I've actually never had any pushback from parents or administrators. I think our students are certainly, for the most part, I would say I work in a fairly, progressive liberal climate, but we try to keep it as nonpartisan as possible, although these days it's more and more difficult to do that. But I think it's important, and I try to stress this with the students, to look at certainly the idea of poverty, the idea of addressing poverty and the goals themselves with, a critical eye. So we do look at, various ways that don't, I guess conflict is an okay word to use, that conflict in terms of how to address poverty. So for example, the film Poverty Inc. looks at the humanitarian industry and really critiques what has been done over, the past several decades, and, what is successful, what is not successful, and then I use that to then help the students again, look at poverty through the lens of, well, what is sustainable, what actually is also, culturally sensitive to people that are trying to get out of poverty, and how can we be aware of what works and not just, look at ourselves as guardian angels who are swooping down and fixing the problem, because clearly that hasn't worked. And the students themselves, I mean, they tend to, they like to debate these things, and so, we try to have a forum where they can do that, but then also, I try to provide access to resources where they can look at things from multiple perspectives and try to widen their worldview.
Great. That's a great answer. Thank you for that. We had as well a great challenge thrown out to us by Dan, one of our participants this evening. So Dan wrote, I love some of these ideas that both of you have presented. He was excited about the whole process and phenomenon of the Millennium Development Goals. However, finding it difficult to imagine where I would be able to fit it into my world experience course. There's only so much time. I'm restricted by standards, tests, etc. And then on further clarification, Dan explained that this is a world history course from the Enlightenment forward, and somebody made a great suggestion about, well, when you get to the Industrial Revolution, or Karl Marx, you talk about poverty today, but Dan said no, he really was interested in not just doing it piecemeal, but doing the whole package. Any thoughts come to mind, Anne-Marie or Kelly, about how how a teacher might think about really adding a full unit on this topic in the context of a social studies survey course?
Yeah, sure. I'll let Kelly speak to this more broadly, but I think, thinking if you want to map out your curriculum for that course and think about where each goal might fit as something that has a relationship or context to something that you're talking about. And so over the course of your year, you're coming to one of the goals. So it is an intentional, explicit way to kind of look at the goals. but not just, but taking a little bit of time in perhaps each unit to make some connections to the goals. I don't know, Kelly, if you have other thoughts.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting because our students have definitely, they are taking, many of them are taking a world history course right now where they've been discussing the Industrial Revolution during the year and capitalism and Marxism and all of that. And so they often refer back to that when we bring up the goals. So I agree with Anne-Marie that it's good to kind of see if you can focus on them at certain points in the year. Another thought might be to, if you introduce them at the beginning of the year and have the students maybe choose a goal or two that they're interested in, and then as the year goes on, try to challenge them with thinking about how they might look at whatever topics you're talking about through the lens of the goals, and think about how the goals actually relate to what you're talking about.
Anne-Marie, how, just a time check with you, do you think that we should address another question, or shall we move on?
We should probably move on at this point, unless I don't see any other questions in the chat box. I will just say I noticed there was one about posters for some of the resources from the global goals. Some of the visuals, they are available to download free. They're usually high resolution, so you could have them printed out somewhere, you know, fairly inexpensively, again, to print out larger size. I don't know off the top of my head, though, if there's other ways that you can buy some of those materials, but I can check for you. But so there's certainly ways to download all of the resources that I've shared for free, which I think brings me to the next piece where can you find a lot of the resources that we mentioned. So first of all, including the recording for this webinar, if you want to go back to look at some of our slides, all of these resources will be on our resource guide at resources.primarysource.org, Global Social Justice. So this resource guide, it's for all of these webinars, for our Global Social Justice webinars, where you'll find the recordings and other materials. So for example, this is a screenshot of what the guide looks like, and there are different categories from some of the resources, how we put them together. So general information about the global goals, you'll see them on the left-hand side here, and all of these links are active and live for you once you get to this site. You'll see the curriculum resources like the world's largest lesson. Kelly mentioned Teach UNICEF, so here we've linked out to the Teach UNICEF Sustainable Development Goals materials. If you want to look at the Global Goals UN Twitter feed, we have that, and that's dynamic, so it will constantly be changing on this page. Other videos we have here, so I'm trying to think if I highlighted anything particular. One of the resources on this is for the knowledge platform for the sustainable development from the UN, and this is where you can find more information on the specific goals and other reports and materials that have been produced here. Another source, again, from our guide, we've also listed books that are out there. So if you want to take a look at the Age of Sustainable Development, Jeffrey Sachs' work, or videos, again, these are videos from the UN and others. Here I've just got an example of mobilizing citizens of the world to achieve the 2030 Agenda. So some of those materials are there on the resource guide. And if there are any other materials that we can point you to, we're certainly happy to do so. But do take a look at those resources to highlight what we've got from this session. So Susan, I think I'm going to turn it over to you.
Wonderful. I just want to thank both of you so much, Kelly and Anne-Marie, for a really such a thoughtful and comprehensive introduction to teaching the goals, and you've given us so many ideas about places to go and connections to make. Thank you to all of our participants for really wonderful thoughts that you shared with each other, and so great to see some of the ways that this will be incorporated or used by so many of you. Up here are some good ways to keep in touch with us, and if you go to the Primary Source homepage for primarysource.org, down in the bottom you'll see all of the links to our social media, and you'll be able to sign up for our newsletter. We would love to have you in our network and our list, and we hope very much that we'll have you join us for our final session of the year on human trafficking and abolition of slavery. And it's been a great night, so thank you all again.
Okay, thank you, Susan, and thank you all for joining us as well.
Thank you.